Hello and welcome to the final session of this afternoon's MediaTel event, Pride in Advertising. I'm Mark Runacus and I'm chair of an organisation called Outvertising, which is UK Advertising's volunteer-run not-for-profit advocacy group. We encourage brands and their partners to be more LGBTQ plus inclusive in their advertising. Well, I'm only here to moderate this session because, as you can see, I'm really lucky to have three genuinely fascinating guests to talk to. Hello, guests. How are you? And we're kind of global because I know Blair is in LA. Good morning, Blair. Everybody else, good afternoon. But let me start with Asad Dhunna, who's founder of the Unmistakables, a business which he says is on a mission to help organizations navigate their way through diversity and inclusion. And before setting up the Unmistakables, Asad worked at PR companies Weber Shandwick and Fleischmann Hillard, and worked on brands including HSBC, Netflix, and TK Maxx. He was previously the volunteer director of communications for Pride in London. I will be calling on your experience, if we may, Asad. But today you're a trustee of AKT, which I hadn't heard of. It's a charity supporting young LGBTQ plus homeless people. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, it's the Albert Kennedy Trust, now branded as AKT.
Ah, okay. I learned something. Didn't know that. Hello, LA. Blair Imani, historian and author. Blair's books are Modern Her Story, stories of women and non-binary people. There we have a copy. Well done. Can I click to buy straight away, Blair? And Making Our Way Home, The Great Migration and the Black American Dream. There we are. When she's not writing and campaigning, Blair presents the anti-racist podcast, America Did What? With Kate Robards. And seriously, I'm a big fan of yours. I recommend you check out Blair's impassioned stories, one of which you'll find on a TEDx on YouTube. Really worth watching. It's a pleasure to meet for the first time Amazin LeThi. And I've been stalking you on YouTube too. Some amazing stories. You began your sports career as a weightlifter, which led to you becoming a natural competitive bodybuilder and fitness author. Driven by your own personal journey, I know you were homeless as well, and your skill in sport, you set up your own foundation and you use sport to develop leadership skills and employment for queer people. But over and above that, you work with governments, with brands, with business all over the world, consulting on diversity and inclusion. Welcome. Amazin too. Thank you everyone for giving your time. So we're talking about brands and pride. And I thought I'd start by asking you what the festivals mean to you, both personally and professionally. And Asad, as I said, as someone who's had a very up close and personal relationship with a Pride organization, can I start with you?
Sure. So professional or personal first? Where should we go, Mark?
Go with personal. I'd love to hear your own personal connection with Pride events.
So I grew up in London. My parents moved over from India in the 70s. And I think growing up, Pride was this thing that was over there. It was very far away. It was like a whole hour on the train to get to. And it felt like a thing that wasn't really for me, probably because I was struggling to come out and I didn't really know where my place was. And then as time went on, and then when I did come out, I just wanted some gay friends, if I'm honest. And so I decided to volunteer for Pride. And I started volunteering in the marketing team. And then I became the director of comms for 2 years. And I guess my personal relationship with Pride started to blend into my professional, because I was bringing the skills that I had at the time working for Weber Shandwick with running the largest LGBT festival in the UK, the third largest one-day event in London. And I got really up close and personal with how brands come to Pride, what they want from it, what they need from it, and also what people need from it. And we ran a survey in 2018 called Pride Matters. And the question was, Pride now means different things to different people, but what does it mean to you? And we started to look at a lot of the data points. And Mark, I know you're a planner and you like data. So we started to look at how 78% of people saw Pride as a celebration, but 42% saw it as a protest. And then when you broke that down and you looked at the 42%, you saw that If you looked at people who weren't lesbian and gay, but you looked at people who were bi, trans, plus, everyone who is actually coming for the protest because visibility isn't there, you see a different need. So how do you bring that all together as one event that has become more mainstream? And then last year when we ran the Pride Jubilee, we looked at the history, how it was a shot glass in New York by Marsha P. Johnson that has triggered global events. So the two sort of they blurred, and I think personally, like I met my boyfriend through Pride, and it did everything became very interconnected. And I think that is the experience of Pride for a lot of people. It is both personal and professional, and I guess through lockdown, there's been a massive blur of that anyway, where we used to bring our whole self to work, and now we're bringing our whole shelves to work, where you can see everything in the background. So yeah, that's been my experience. Probably maybe a little bit too professional, but I don't think there is such a thing as being too gay. I did used to say it was my gay job and my day job, but I don't volunteer anymore.
At least 2 sound bites in there, Asad. Fantastic. Thank you. Blair's agreeing with me. But Blair, now you this year, on a more serious note, I think you were set to be one of the major headline acts at Imani Fest, which sadly, of course, didn't happen. It was going to be the world's first ever Muslim Pride event. And you also had your own T-shirt range last year as well, didn't you?
Yeah,
are they still on sale?
I'm not sure if they're still on sale, but so last year, I'll start with the professional, then talk about the personal. So basically, after I came out in this very public way that very much enmeshed my work as a public figure and my personal life, because I was in the midst of correcting Tucker Carlson. And I always tell people, like, for those who don't know what Fox News or like Tucker Carlson means in the context, is as if the Sun newspaper had their own TV show. If you can call it a newspaper. And so I came out on Tucker Carlson tonight, and I was not intentional. He was saying I wasn't there to speak on behalf of Black people or Muslim people. And I was like, oh, or he was saying I wasn't there to speak on behalf of Black people or LGBT people. And I was like, oh, well, actually, in addition to being a Muslim woman, I'm a Black queer person, like, you know, to clarify my point. And then I realized I had just come out on national television. So that was 2017. And since then, I've been really blessed to be able to like ride the waves of like what could have just been like a meme moment. I think that's what happens oftentimes, is that people's personal lives in the context of Pride and being queer are turned into like a coming out moment, and it's separated from their humanity. So it was really important to me to like put that into context and talk about how, like, when I first came out to my mom when I was 15, you know, I very dramatically sat her down on the couch and told her I was a lesbian. And then she was like, no. And I was like, what do you mean? And she's like, you're probably bisexual. And she was right. We looked it up, and I was like, that fits perfectly. But like when I came out publicly, I realized how much being out was affecting my professional life, because all of a sudden, everyone who I'd made connections with over the, you know, previous 2 years of coming into the public light had very different opinions in some cases about who I was as a person, what my morality was like, all of that. And so I'm very blessed it happened early in my career, because oftentimes people face that at a different time and not in the best way. But last year for New York City Pride, I was really excited because I was on the banners up and down from the Washington Square Park. Like, it was just beautiful to see. Like, I've always wanted to be like a model, but it was too much work. So I decided to become a historian, which is equal amounts of work, but it suits me better. And it was fun because I got to do both. And but it also had the question of the corporate aspect of Pride, because, and I know we'll get into this later, but for example, they had put my giant portrait next to a food truck, like a food table, like I was on the beverage table. And that was just bizarre to me because, like, one, I didn't consent to that. Two, they had tried to not pay us. And then three, I finally decided not to participate in the main Pride event, because it took my friend Jason Rosenberg, who recently was arrested in the midst of the Black Lives Matter protest and who is an ACT UP activist, a white Jewish gay man, who told me no one should be making money on Pride. And I was like, you know, like, I've made my money, I've done my campaigns, you know, especially last year, let me really go and work with the people. So I did the Reclaim Pride March. So it can't really separate, like, you know, like Asad said, I can't separate the personal and the professional. But what I do try to do is put my personal context in coming and understanding as to what Pride is. And it's so evolved, because now I understand that it's this multifaceted, diverse celebration where people can refuel for the rest of the year, even though it's very draining on us who are doing these panels and who are like working with these companies. But when I was a kid, I was like, what is this magical party of rainbows of people marching down the street? And it was very abstract to me. But now I see so many different sides of it. And I'm really glad that people are starting to engage with the history.
Amazin, how about your relationship with the prides that you've seen, both personally and professionally?
Sure. So I spent my formative years in Australia. And obviously, the Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras has always been known as one of the biggest gay prides in the world. And, you know, I grew up in an all-white background in the suburbs. I saw no Asian people on TV or in the media. I didn't know any LGBTQ people. And when I think of prides now, it's for many, it's this coming out revolutionary experience of being able to meet the LGBTQ community for the first time and realizing that, you know, the feelings that you have inside, the struggles that you have had, it's not a singular experience, it's a community experience, and you're part of a wider community. And for me, it was just always seen, and even now, and I think, you know, for many of us who are activists as well as part of the community, it can be hard to separate the professional and the business and the personal side. But, you know, back then with Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras, it wasn't that corporate. And I didn't understand the relationship then between, you know, brands and the LGBTQ community. For me, it was really just a celebration of the richness and the diversity of the community. And I think, you know, for me, it's evolved over the years. I mean, I travel around the world globally. I participate in prides. I consult with brands and governments around LGBTQ inclusion within their community, particularly around the Asian community, of, you know, how you engage there. And then, you know, if you're a brand stepping into Pride for the first time, you know, what does that look like for you, and what's the outcome, and what's going to be the lasting effect, you know, for your brand as well as the gay community. You know, for me professionally, I think because I wasn't able to celebrate as much as I could have when I was younger, because when I saw Pride when I was much younger, I never saw any Asian people at Pride. It was always just me. So now, as an advocate in the field of, you know, the gay community and Pride, I still find it as a celebration of being, you know, who I am within the community, and, you know, professionally being an activist, you know, amplifying my voice as an LGBTQ activist in the community, particularly around storytelling within Pride, because I understand the importance of that, particularly for my community, because so few of us see ourselves in the media, and we struggle so deeply in terms of coming out and taking those first steps into a Pride.
Amazin, you mentioned the corporate nature of it, and I want to come back to that, maybe talk to you, Blair, but let's focus on the heart of this issue that we've been asked to talk about, which is the fact that there is this calendar focus on Pride throughout the year. Is that a good thing? What do you think about that, Blair? And I'm old enough to remember when Prides were not corporate. How do we feel about that?
So I think for me, it's holding two things sacred, right? Like, I'll use the example of Black History Month here in the States, especially, you know, Juneteenth having recently passed, and this, you know, there's kind of this cacophony of attention around it. And as a historian, like, I was being very upfront with my audience, like, how many of you have heard about this before this time? So I think there's an importance in a calendar focus. You know, I'll use my book as an example. You know, my book was promoted heavily during Black History Month, which is February in the States, October in the UK. There's a gay couple on the front. You know, my uncle Lester was a gay Black man. This is an original family photo. I had myself and my partner shopped into it. This is my great aunt's great uncle Lester, who is gay. So we gave him a partner because in the original photo, he looks rather awkward and unhappy with the woman that he's plucked to find to be in his picture. even though my book is very heavily Black history focused, it's very queer focused because, you know, people call me an activist historian, but I just try to tell the truth. But because we focus on the identity of Blackness, and because it's been so heavily inundated with like patriarchy and heteronormativeness, people exclude that. So my book ends up on the list for, you know, Black authors, etc., but it's not included during Pride Month. And I've been pushing against that. And, you know, the Advocate did a great job of promoting me. So the thing is, when we put something into the context of a calendar, then sometimes people can use their own biases to exclude what happens or like who gets elevated. So when it comes to Pride, people can check a box. And so I think it's a great time for corporate giving. It's a great time for nonprofits. I always do whenever, because I'm also an influencer in addition to being a historian, I make sure there's a giving component. And I do that year round. However, brands are much more receptive to paying you and then paying someone else or donating elsewhere. And this is a time where a lot of people are drumming that up. The problem is when people try to extract that and then say, okay, now the rest of the year, can we have our gay employees and trans employees be quiet? Can we just not hear from you? Can we not do as much programming? They try to put it on the shelf. And, you know, Asad said, we're bringing our self to work, and now we're bringing our shelf to work. Like, it's really that thing of you have to create an infrastructure where there's this time where we're focused and we're highlighted, because that's crucial. But we also have to incorporate it into the everyday work that we're doing, because if you celebrate Pride and you give, you know, millions of dollars away, but your trans employee can't come out or can't be accepted or is, you know, under fear of reprisal for being their full selves, then what's the point?
Asad, when you were working with brands, did they ever say, could you spread this out a bit so that we can have a focus throughout the year? Or are they quite happy that there is a specific calendar focus?
I don't know if they're happy. I think they're accustomed to it. And so if you look at the conversation around Pride, like I was comms director, right? So we tracked the term Pride in London. We looked at how did that measure over the year, and you see the spike. There's like a medium term spike around LGBT History Month in February. So it was like my role was, how do we capitalize on that conversation, get into it, and then run it through to July where it peaks again. And we always used to joke about peak Pride. Like there's a moment where everyone's like, it's peak Pride, the rainbows are everywhere, like, and it's intense, and Downing Street is open and all the flags are going up and you've got to go to all the things. And it's really exhausting as a person. I've realized that this year I was sort of missing it. There was a bit of a mourning of that, but then all of a sudden all of the influxes came in of like, can you speak on this, can you speak on that, can you do this, can you do that? And you're like, okay, how do I keep up, how do I capitalize on that? Because as you say, Blair, like I give the fees that I get around Pride to AKT because that's a way to give back to the community that then serves the rest of the year. So I don't think brands are happy about it. I think they're accustomed to it. And if you're a marketing director looking at your calendar of the year, you say, well, this is when I'm going to do it. And I would equate it to Ramadan, right? Like it's, people assume that Muslims are just Muslims around Ramadan. Now, some people are, they get more pious during that month. And Blair's nodding and laughing because it's true. But it's then saying, well, how do you make it work? And I think there's no really wrong or right answer. I think you have to work with what there is and work that out. What I do know of brands that get into Pride, and we could probably talk about sponsorship later, is they start thinking about this in December or January. They're signing contracts at that point, and then you've got 6 months of campaign planning. So actually people are thinking about Pride, but they're running up. It's like a Christmas campaign, isn't it?
And you kind of do make it sound like it's a big thing. And I wonder, Amazin, one for you is, are there ways that a brand can kind of feel their way through this rather than suddenly being emblazoned all over, you know, a big New York Pride or a San Francisco Pride or one of the, you know,
Sure.
Sydney Pride? As a brand, I might be a bit scared about diving straight in. Any advice for brands on how to feel their way into this?
Sure. I've put up a quote that I said in a interview that I love because I feel it's kind of synonymous of this, is that, you know, Pride isn't just a festival. It's also a sense of feeling of joy of what it is to be LGBTQ. And for me, when I'm consulting with brands, it's about them understanding this feeling of what it is to be LGBTQ, because it's part of our identity. Like, it's not a light switch that, you know, 1st of June, I switch it on, end of June, I turn it off. You know, it only happens for like, you know, 1 month of the year. And, you know, for brands that are just starting this journey, you know, I have that internal conversation with them of, what does it look like internally for your business before you start looking externally? The things that you're doing internally, such as setting up Pride and Ally networks, such as looking at making sure that you have LGBTQ policies in place, gender neutral toilets, because it starts setting a tone in terms of what it is to be LGBTQ before you get to that full 1 month where you suddenly kind of burst out to the whole world. And then, you know, like as Asad says, you know, brands are planning a year in advance with their budgets to what Pride looks like. It's going to be, you know, in 2021. So then, you know, as I'm having those internal conversations with those brands of what it is to be LGBTQ in the workplace, and what are the kind of things that you need, the steps that you need to take to get there, to make your workplace environment, you know, safe and welcoming to the LGBTQ community, is then, you know, then what does that external focus look like? And that could be a very easy step of creating a Pride t-shirt with your brand logo on it, with some rainbow, you know, images, and that and then your staff with your Pride and Ally network that you created 1 year ago ends up walking in that. So, like, you know, really simple steps before you get to that kind of big branding of, then we're going to come out with, you know, massive marketing campaigns around LGBTQ stories and floats and singers and dancers. So it's, I feel it's, for brands, it's a step-by-step process of making them feel comfortable and also feeling their way through the community, and also their journey in terms of, you know, what does that look like externally for them.
Asad, do you want to say something? I think
I was going to add that the experience that I had speaking to the employees of brands who were sponsoring or managing these campaigns is, when you talk to them about the roots of how they got to the float or how they got to their activation, it was more often than not coming from the LGBT employees who were saying, we want to go to Pride, we want to go under the banner of our employer, which as a psychological shift over 50 years is quite fascinating, that the place that we work has become the safe space that you want to take to somewhere like Pride, which was initially a protest. And there's similar debates happening right now around Black Lives Matter and where do brands fit within that. And I think that's quite fascinating, that it's the employees that start the conversation. Somewhere along the line, the marketer catches whiff of it and says, opportunity, eyeballs, and that's where there's a tension, and you have to pull it back. And I think, as Amazin correctly says, it's all about the internal feeding the external.
I think what we're getting to is another thing that I am often asked by brands, which is how do I get the tone right? And I want to weave into that, because we've talked about Black Lives Matter, the importance for us. And another area that brands are scared about is what we call intersectionality. Sometimes our vocabulary is a bit impenetrable for them, and I apologize, but you guys know what I mean. Blair, what about that? How do we get the tone right? And give us your advice on intersectionality.
Absolutely. So, you know, the first thing I have to do is cite Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, who developed the term intersectionality. She's also responsible for the hashtag Say Her Name, which is specific to women victims of police violence and vigilante violence. It's important to cite her because I tell, you know, young people, I use the example of Old Town Road, like knowing a song, but not knowing that Lil Nas X made it. And they're all like, oh, I get it. But anyway, so I have to cite that. That's where intersectionality comes from. And in that same way, she created it as this theory of understanding the dual identities of being a woman and being Black, and how, you know, I don't get to wake up and decide, today I'm going to be Muslim, today I'm going to be bisexual. I'm all of the things all the time. And it all gets very delightful and radiant and multifaceted, but I don't get to choose one at a time. And so in that same way, as policies were being made against sexism and policies were getting made against racism, Black women were not benefiting because there was no accounting for encompassing both of those things. So that's how we have to approach intersectionality, is looking at making sure that we're not being like, you know, kind of a one-trick pony in our approach to solving things. And so that really connects to how brands can step into it. odds are you have someone in your team who has been trying to fight this battle since before there was this kind of groundswell of people realizing anti-racism was a worthwhile endeavor. So what I've been encouraging brands to do is to keep things in their brand voice, to keep things in their brand context. For example, I'm consulting with a nail polish brand. I've worked with them for a while, but the first time I reached out to them, I said, you know, I'd love to work with you, because they reached out to me. They wanted to send me a gift, and I was like, I'd love to work with you, but there's not enough diversity on your page. It's all white hands, you know, and that doesn't mean, you know, my hands are fairly fair, but, you know, let's look at the diversity. And instead of blocking me, they listened to me, they made changes, and, you know, 3 years on, we're working together. So it's about listening. And, you know, when somebody did make those calls to action, to go back and listen to them and pay them to consult. You know, they're paying me now to consult per hour. They're actually paying me more than I asked, which is lovely. But it's really important because, you know, you can't just rely on people to do the work and tokenize them. You have to cherish them and hold them sacred, and then pay them appropriately, especially if you're going to be reaping the benefits.
Asad, you're nodding. Advice to brands when you were at Pride in London about getting the tone right?
I think there's a fear, and that's the bit that needs to be overcome. And that fear has circulated again with Black Lives Matter. People don't know what they can and can't say. And I don't know where that comes from. I think it's a broader societal point, to be honest, Mark. I don't think it's just about pride and LGBT voices. I think there's a general feeling that people don't know what they can and can't say. We're all stuck at home. We're all, you know, in bubbles in social media where we're not really listening and hearing other people. And I think the one thing for me in communities like ours is the level of nuance and the true understanding that LGBT and the plus, they're all different and they can't all be lumped together. And so when you asked about intersectionality, it's a similar thing to say, okay, intersectionality for people listening is where you have two protected characteristics or more that overlap, and that creates a new dynamic for someone, and it probably creates more discrimination. So when you have that, what does that mean? So if you're let's say a white gay man of a certain age, that means something. If you are a black trans woman, that's different, and that nuance is lacking for a lot of people, where they think, well, pride is just the white gay man on a bus going down the middle of the street, because that's sanitized for people. It's easy to buy into that, but I think we're seeing that needs to be challenged.
So I was trying to think of the best way to kind of help those who are watching and listening, because we're going to run out of time in a minute, and it's probably to ask you guys as experts to give your point of view on what you think is a great example of a brand and a pride working together. Amazin, can I ask you, can you think of one where you think it's been really good and it's worked
Sure.
for both sides, if you know what I mean?
Sure. I mean, I think, you know, one very good example is Nike. I think, you know, Nike always gets their branding spots on, and they're always very ahead of the game in terms of current affairs, current stories, and storytelling. I mean, when I work with brands, particularly around, you know, being Asian and marketing to the Asian community and the difference between East and West, and also then using different platforms like sport within your branding, it's all around storytelling, and you have to lead with those sharing their own story. You know, Nike gets it right in terms of the Be True campaign, because then they come out with LGBTQ athletes, and and the conversations are intersectional, and they're sharing their own stories. You know, when Colin Kaepernick knelt, you know, Nike used that opportunity to talk about racism and the challenges and barriers that people of minority backgrounds have by sharing different stories of very high profile athletes like Serena Williams. So, you know, but it's really about then, you know, I think that the importance is, you know, listening to the community, seeing what's current within the community, having those current conversations, but then making sure that those who are sharing those stories within your campaign are those people. It's not like a white man behind it. And also, you know, when you're making these campaigns, you have the community behind it. I think a really good current example is around the coronavirus racism towards the Asian community. There were numerous companies that came out with different campaigns and different kinds of marketing material, but unfortunately, they were all off brand and were actually quite racist in their tone because they didn't, and it was quite obvious that they hadn't consulted the Asian community and they didn't have an Asian person driving that campaign and checkpoints along the way. You know, you must have checkpoints within your company before you release something externally and think, you know, are the pronouns right? Is the right person involved in the campaign of that image? If we're showing an image on a t-shirt, is that the right image that we should be using? Is the tone of the language correct? Because it could absolutely backfire on you. And I think with the power of social media, that backfire could be catastrophic for your company within 24 hours.
And Blair, briefly, can you think of a great example of a brand partnership that you think has worked well in your estimation?
Absolutely. So one that I'm really proud of, because I know the internal dynamics of it, was Tom's Shoes in 2019. They already do the external giving. They're like the pioneers of that. What I really like is that they saw the need, recognized that, okay, we've met the need for shoes. Let's shift to giving grants from our profits. And so that was really awesome because instead of, you know, just duplicating and doing what they've done well, they adapted upon it and improved. They also worked internally within their employees and elevated the queer employees who've been raising the bar on queer inclusion. There's also an educational component and a giving component. So for me, it really hit all the marks. Internal engagement, external engagement with the brand and a giving partner. And then also the way they reached out to different individuals, they reached out to non-binary people and allowed folks to be able to craft their own message, with Tom's being the person to carry, or the brand to carry it. And I think that's a holistic way to approach it, treating people as people, meeting them where they are, and giving.
Great example. Thank you, Asad. If a brand owner is watching, where would you tell them to look at as a great case history?
I would tell them to go to the Unmistakables.com, which is the company that I run, obviously. Let's have a look. A good case study is actually this one by Budweiser. So Budweiser did this in London. They were a sponsor last year. And they decided, well, the marketing insight was there's a lot of waste around cups that are around Pride. So they said, well, we'll create these recyclable cups. And then they created them in all the different flags. So this is a gender fluid flag, and they created a range. Now, certain people looked at that and went, is it a bit tokenistic? But they did the work and they really tried to understand what all the flags meant. They worked with different people in the community to get there. And the bit I really like is the fact, as Blair said, that they gave to Pride. Like, Prides don't happen for free. They cost money to close roads. It costs money to put on all the entertainment and make that happen. So they gave and put money in. So I thought this was quite smart. Like, I've kept the cup because it's a good pen holder, but I think it's a nice idea of how they took an insight, which was the waste of Pride, and then they found a way to make some sustainability out of it.
Thank you. We sadly have run out of time. I've learned so much just by listening to you guys for the past 25 minutes or so. So on behalf of all the people who are watching and listening, thank you so much. If you can imagine all the applause that would have been happening had we been able to be together and do this physically. Personally, I'm so sorry that I can't do my Pride March this year. It does mean a lot to me, but we can still, I'm sure you guys are doing this a lot, we can still connect with each other and support each other as you have done this afternoon. So thank you from the bottom of my heart, and I look forward to seeing you physically very, very soon.